The sun dipped low over the African plains, the horizon bleeding gold and crimson into the tall, whispering grass. In the far corner of an abandoned wildlife sanctuary, behind bars coated in rust and time, a lion named Raffi lay in silence. His mane, once golden and full, had faded into tangled dust. His ribs pressed against his skin, each breath shallow, each blink slower than the last. Once he had been a symbol of majesty, a performer in a circus, a crowd's fleeting marvel, but the applause had ended. The humans had left, and only the wind stayed to remember his name. The sanctuary itself was dying. The fences sagged, the water holes were cracked mud, and the last caretaker had left weeks ago after funds disappeared. The animals that could run had already run. Only Raffi remained, trapped by weakness more than walls. He had stopped roaring long ago. The sky was silent. The world had moved on. Then one hot afternoon, a line of black SUVs appeared through the dust, engines purring like something alive. A young man stepped out, wearing a cap, a faded shirt, and a look of heartbreak. His name was Jimmy Donaldson, MrBeast. He had seen the story in passing, a dying sanctuary in the middle of nowhere. To most, it was another tragedy buried in the algorithm. But to him, it was something he couldn't scroll past. He walked quietly through the broken gates, cameras following behind but staying distant. The smell of rust and decay filled the air. Birds scattered as he moved, his shoes crunching over dry soil. When he reached Raffi's cage, the lion lifted his head weakly. The two locked eyes, one filled with exhaustion, the other with quiet resolve. "Hey, buddy," Jimmy whispered, kneeling. "You've had it rough, haven't you?" He reached out, not close enough to touch, but enough for the lion to feel something he hadn't in years: gentleness. "Don't worry," Jimmy said, voice breaking slightly. "We're going to fix this, I promise." The first days were chaos, crews rebuilding broken enclosures, trucks unloading food and medicine, local vets rushing in. But amid the noise and work, Raffi remained still. He refused to eat, too tired to fight for survival. Each evening, after everyone left, he would sit outside the cage, cross-legged, telling stories into the fading light about saving oceans, planting trees, helping people he had never met. "You know," he said one night, staring at the dying sun, "I've helped millions of humans, but somehow you hit different." And for the first time in weeks, he lifted his head without trembling. Jimmy smiled softly. "Yeah," he whispered, "you get it." Days turned to weeks. Jimmy refused to film much of it, saying some moments didn't belong on camera. He was there every morning with fresh meat, talking in that same calm, hopeful tone. "You don't owe anyone your roar," he told Raffi once. "Just get better. That's enough." As the horizon glowed pale orange, Jimmy stood by the cage and saw something that stopped him. Raffi was standing. His legs shook, but he stood tall, eyes alert, mane catching the light. Slowly he stepped toward the food bowl and ate. The crew fell silent. The vets looked at each other, tears in their eyes. Jimmy laughed, covering his face, overwhelmed. "You did it," he said, voice trembling. "You're not giving up." From that day, the sanctuary changed. Green began to return. Streams flowed again. Birds came back. The air no longer smelled of death but of rain and dust and life. Raffi's transformation was miraculous. His mane regained its color, his roar deepened with strength. He walked with pride again, not as a showpiece but as a survivor. When the time came to release him into the wild reserve, Jimmy gathered the team. "No speeches," he said quietly. "This isn't about me." The sun rose behind them as the cage door creaked open. Raffi hesitated at first, glancing at Jimmy with a look that was neither fear nor confusion, but understanding. Jimmy stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "You're free now. Go live the way you were meant to." The lion took one step, then another, until his paws touched the open earth. He paused, turned back, and met Jimmy's eyes one last time. For a long heartbeat. One who had given hope, and one who had reclaimed it. Then, with a deep breath, Rafi roared. The sound tore through the valley, strong, beautiful, and endless. It echoed off hills, through trees, and into the hearts of everyone who heard it. Jimmy closed his eyes, smiling through tears. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what hope sounds like." That night, as the stars glimmered above the camp, Jimmy sat by the fire, silent. His friend Chris asked softly, "You think anyone will understand what this means?" Jimmy poked the fire with a stick, watching the embers rise. "Maybe not," he said. "But somewhere out there, someone's going to see this and remember that life's worth fighting for, even when it's almost gone, far away in the wild." The sound of Rafi's roar rolled across the night once more, not a sound of pain, but of gratitude. It was as if the earth itself whispered thank you to the man who didn't walk away, because sometimes saving one life saves something much bigger. Sometimes kindness doesn't echo, it roars. And on that golden plain, under the endless stars, a millionaire with a golden heart didn't just save a lion, he saved hope itself. Days passed, then weeks, but Rafi's roar never really faded from Jimmy's mind. Back in America, surrounded by screens and schedules, he'd catch himself staring out the window, remembering the sound of wind in the Savannah grass, that single moment when the world had gone still, when hope had taken the shape of a lion. The video they'd filmed at the sanctuary went live months later. It wasn't dramatic or fast-paced like the usual challenges. It was quiet, raw, and real. The opening showed Rafi in his cage, weak and frail, and then slowly cut to his release, the moment the gate opened and the roar split the sky. There was no music, no flashy editing, just silence, wind, and truth. Within hours, it exploded across the internet. People around the world wrote messages that made Jimmy stop scrolling and cry. A boy from India said, "I was going to give up on rescuing street dogs, but this made me believe again." A woman from Brazil commented, "I lost my husband, and this story reminded me that even after loss, life can roar again." Conservation groups reached out, inspired to rebuild sanctuaries that had been forgotten, and donations poured in, not just for Rafi's home, but for animals everywhere. Yet, despite the viral storm, Jimmy stayed quiet about it. He didn't brag, didn't chase the numbers. When people asked him in interviews why he spent millions to save just one lion, he smiled softly and said, "Because sometimes one life is enough to change how the world feels." A year later, he returned to Africa, this time without a full production crew, just a few close friends and a small camera. The sanctuary had transformed. Where there had been cracked dirt, now flowers bloomed. The workers greeted him with hugs and stories of new cubs born in the reserve. Rafi had become somewhat of a legend there, the lion with the golden mane who had once faced death and lived. They drove through the open reserve, searching for him. Hours passed with no sign. Then, just as the sun began to dip, they saw him standing tall on a hill, his mane glowing like fire in the fading light. Rafi turned his head slowly as the vehicle approached, his eyes steady, calm, and alive. Jimmy stepped out and stood still, keeping his distance. The lion looked at him for a long moment, and then, as if recognizing an old friend, gave a low, deep rumble. Not a full roar, but something gentler, almost like a greeting. Jimmy's throat tightened. He whispered, "Hey buddy, still free, huh?" For a while, they just stood there. No cameras, no words, just the wind carrying their silence. Then Rafi turned and walked away into the tall grass, disappearing beneath the crimson sky. That night, Jimmy sat by the same fire pit they had used a year ago. The stars above seemed endless. Chris broke the silence. "Do you ever think you'll stop doing this? The rescues, the giving?" Jimmy smiled faintly. "Maybe one day, but not yet. Not while there's still something out there that needs saving. He looked toward the dark hills where Rafi had vanished. You know, he continued, I used to think happiness was about doing big things, breaking records, making noise. But now I think it's about doing something that outlives you, something that keeps breathing even when you're gone. Chris nodded quietly. The fire crackled between them. Above, the stars shimmered, the same stars that hung above Rafi as he slept somewhere in the wild, unchained, unbroken. And though the world moved on, though new videos came and new stories unfolded, that one roar, that single act of compassion, became something timeless. Teachers told it to students, parents showed it to their children, and people whispered it to themselves on dark nights when faith felt too far away. Because what MrBeast did wasn't just about saving an animal, it was about reminding a weary world that kindness can still win, that empathy is not extinct, and that sometimes hope has fur a mane and the courage to roar again. Long after the fire died and the camp fell silent, the wind carried a faint echo across the plains, the distant call of a lion beneath a silver moon. And somewhere, sitting beneath that same sky, Jimmy heard it too. He smiled, closed his eyes, and whispered, Roar loud, my friend, the world needs to hear you. Because a millionaire with a golden heart, he saved a feeling the world was forgetting. He saved hope itself months later. Jimmy found himself back in his studio, surrounded by bright lights, half-empty coffee cups, and computer screens flashing with plans for his next big project. But even as his team talked excitedly about building houses, funding schools, or planting forests, his mind wandered to the savannah. He could still see the tall grass swaying the horizon, glowing gold, and that one unforgettable look in Rafi's eyes before he disappeared into the wild. Every so often, Jimmy would pause mid-conversation, lost in thought. His friends noticed. You're thinking about him again, aren't you? Chris asked one night while they edited footage. Jimmy smiled faintly. Yeah, he admitted. I just wonder how he's doing out there, if he's still free, still roaring. Then, one afternoon, an email arrived from the sanctuary. The subject line was simple. He's still alive. Jimmy opened it immediately. The email was from Lindy, the head caretaker, who had taken over the sanctuary after his visit. Attached were a few photos, grainy but clear enough to make his heart race. There was Rafi, stronger than ever, leading a small pride. His mane was thick and glowing in the sunlight, and beside him stood 2 lionesses. That night, he couldn't sleep. Instead, he went live on his second channel. No script, no edits, just his voice and the sound of rain against the window. I've done a lot of crazy things, he said softly, staring into the camera. But saving that lion, that changed me. I used to think giving meant money, that I could solve problems just by spending enough. But I learned it's not money that saves lives, it's care. It's showing up when the world doesn't. A year later, he returned to Africa once more, not with cameras, not with sponsors, but just with friends and a quiet heart. The sanctuary was thriving now, home to dozens of animals. The locals greeted him as a brother, children running up shouting, "Beast, beast," and laughing. But Jimmy had one purpose: to see Rafi again. They drove deep into the reserve, hours from the nearest fence. The sun was high, painting everything gold. They waited near a watering hole, cameras off, dust swirling in the heat. Then, out of the tall grass, came a sound, a low, distant rumble. It grew louder, steadier, more powerful. Rafi emerged from the shadows, flanked by his pride. His body was massive, his mane shimmering in sunlight. Jimmy froze. He's even more beautiful than I remember, he whispered. The lion stopped a few meters away, studying the humans. Jimmy didn't move. Slowly, Rafi stepped closer, close enough that the two could see each other clearly. Their eyes met once again, and for the second time in their lives, words became unnecessary. There was understanding in that gaze, gratitude, strength, and peace. Then Raffi lifted his head to the sky and roared. The sound rolled across the plain, a thunderous declaration that life had won. Jimmy closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. "You did it," he whispered. "You became everything you were meant to be." The pride moved on, disappearing into the horizon, the echo of their roars fading with the wind. Jimmy stood there long after they were gone, hands trembling slightly. "You see that?" he said quietly. "That's what hope looks like when it grows up." When he flew home days later, he didn't tell anyone about the encounter. It became a memory he kept close, one that didn't need to be shared to be real. In his next video, instead of a big challenge or stunt, he simply said, "If you ever think the world's too broken to fix, remember this. Even the quietest act of kindness can roar louder than hate." Years would pass, new videos would come, and the internet would keep moving. But somewhere under the same stars, Raffi would still roam, his cubs growing, his legacy stretching further than the Savannah itself. Because when one man chose to care, he didn't just change a life, he changed the story of what humanity could be. A millionaire with a golden heart didn't just save a lion that day, he saved something rarer. He saved hope itself. On the second anniversary of Raffi's freedom, Jimmy returned to Africa once again. This time, the sanctuary was larger, protected by government support and powered by renewable energy funded through Project Roar. Lindy met him at the entrance, her eyes gleaming. "He's waiting," she said with a smile. They drove for hours through the open reserve until they reached a ridge overlooking a wide plain. There, under the setting sun, lay Raffi. He was older, slower now, but his presence still filled the horizon. As the jeep approached, he lifted his head and let out a low, rumbling growl, not of threat, but of acknowledgement. Jimmy stepped out slowly, just as he had years ago. He didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. The lion rose to his feet, his movements deliberate, powerful even in age. For a few eternal seconds, man and lion stared at each other, the air between them thick with memory. Then Raffi did something unexpected. He took a few steps forward and lowered his head slightly, eyes soft and knowing. Jimmy froze, his breath catching. It felt like the world had stopped. He whispered, "It's okay, old friend. You can rest now." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in amber and violet. Raffi turned slowly, walking toward the long grass one last time. His cubs followed behind, their silhouettes merging with the golden light. The last thing Jimmy saw before darkness fell was Raffi glancing back, as if to say goodbye. That night, back at camp, Lindy approached Jimmy by the fire. Her voice was gentle. "He's getting old. When he's gone, his pride will take over this territory. It's the circle." Jimmy nodded quietly, staring into the flames. "He did more than survive," he said. "He taught us how to live." A few weeks later, word came that Raffi had passed peacefully under a starlit sky, surrounded by his pride. The locals buried him beneath the ridge where he used to rest, placing stones around the spot. They called it the Hill of Hope. Jimmy returned for the burial. There were no cameras, no speeches, just silence and the sound of wind through grass. He knelt by the mound, tracing his hand over the stone that bore Raffi's name. "Thank you," he whispered, "for reminding me what it means to care." When he stood up, the horizon shimmered with the morning sun, and somewhere in the distance, one of Raffi's sons let out a roar, deep, full, and alive. Jimmy smiled, tears on his cheeks, and whispered, "Keep it going." As he walked away, he looked back one last time. The savannah glowed with light, the grass dancing in the breeze. Life had gone on, but hope, that quiet, stubborn, golden thing, still roared across the plains. Because the lion may have been gone, but the message remained. Kindness echoes longer than we live. And so, long after the world forgets names and numbers, it will remember a moment when one man, a millionaire with a golden heart, didn't just save a lion, he saved hope itself.